Hello, all you freedom-loving people. More details are surfacing about Xi Jinping losing power, from plans of the next CCP meeting to news of a Shaolin monk scandal, and Canada is also losing favor with President Trump. We'll also give more details about the mysterious Fed. Okay, let's get into it. Last night, President Trump announced that the United States had reached a full and complete trade deal with South Korea. The deal with South Korea, similar to his deal with the European Union, lowers tariffs from 25% to 15% in exchange for increased investment in U.S. energy. President Trump posted on True Social, the deal is that South Korea will give the United States $350 billion for investment owned and controlled by the United States and selected by myself as president. Additionally, South Korea will purchase $100 billion worth of liquefied natural gas or other energy products. It is also agreed that South Korea will be completely open to trade with the United States and that they will accept American products, including cars and trucks, agriculture, etc. The deal is expected to be finalized when South Korean President Lee Jae-myung visits the White House for a meeting within the next 2 weeks. And yesterday, the White House also announced another round of tariff updates about Brazil, which included President Trump's executive orders that end duty-free treatment for low-cost imports by suspending the de minimis exemption. The order also included 50% tariffs on semi-finished copper products, excluding refined copper. It also raised tariffs on Brazilian imports by 40%, bringing the total to 50%. The copper tariffs take effect August 1st, and the de minimis change takes effect August 29th. The move aims to counter extraordinary Brazilian policies that harm U.S. interests, including human rights abuses and the political persecution of President Jair Bolsonaro. Yesterday, the Treasury Department announced that it had sanctioned Brazilian Supreme Federal Court Justice Alexandre de Moraes. De Moraes is overseeing the case against President Bolsonaro, who is accused of involvement in an alleged coup attempt in January of 2023. As a result of the sanctions, all of de Moraes' property and assets that are located within the United States have been frozen. In addition, all assets in the possession of any U.S. person and any assets where de Moraes has a 50% or more stake have also been frozen. The Treasury Department also warned that any corporation or financial institution that engage in certain transactions or activities that are considered to violate the sanctions against de Moraes could also be sanctioned. And today, regarding Canada, President Trump said that it would be very hard to reach a trade deal after Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney announced his plan to recognize a Palestinian state. Yesterday, Carney said that Canada plans to recognize Palestinian statehood at the 80th United Nations General Assembly in September if the Palestinian Authority undertakes reforms. These reforms include holding general elections next year in which Hamas can play no part. The reforms also include rejecting the militarization of a Palestinian state. Carney said that lasting peace in the region requires a reformed Palestinian state alongside peacehood for Israel, but Israel rejected the recognition that Carney proposed. Today at the press briefing, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt also mentioned President Trump's disagreement with the leaders of Canada, France, and the UK about a proposed Palestinian state.
On the second question about a Palestinian state, the president expressed his displeasure and his disagreement with the leaders of France, the United Kingdom, and Canada. He feels as though that's rewarding Hamas at a time where Hamas is the true impediment to a ceasefire and to the release of all of the hostages. So to your first question, the president wants to see all of the hostages released. He cares deeply about this. He has met with many of the former hostages, many of the families of those who have loved ones who are still being held hostage in Gaza. I have met with them too. It is absolutely devastating what these poor people have been through, and the president is always thinking about them, and that's why he's designated his special envoy Steve Witkoff, who's doing a tremendous job to release the hostages and to end this conflict. But the president has always said the last remaining hostages, now there are 20 living hostages in Gaza, will always be the hardest because Hamas is unfortunately using these innocent people as bargaining chips. But nevertheless, we are committed to seeing this come to an end.
So If no trade deal is reached between the United States and Canada by August 1st, the U.S. will impose a 35% tariff on all Canadian goods that are not covered by the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. Earlier this week, Carney said that trade negotiations with the United States were in an intense phase, but he suggested that a deal could still be possible. And regarding Mexico, President Trump had a phone call with Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum today. Vice President J.D. Vance, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and other White House officials joined the call. After the phone call, President Trump announced that he would not raise tariffs on Mexican goods for 90 days. This means that Mexico will continue to face a 50% levy on aluminum, copper, and steel, and a 25% tariff on automobiles. President Trump wrote on Truth Social that the complexities of a deal with Mexico are somewhat different than other nations because of both the problems and assets of the border. President Trump also stated that Mexico had agreed to immediately terminate its non-tariff trade barriers, of which there were many. President Sheinbaum also wrote on X, "We avoided the tariff increase announced for tomorrow and secured 90 days to build a long-term agreement through dialogue." And today, reporters asked President Trump if Canada's move to recognize a Palestinian state was a deal breaker. President Trump said, "I didn't like what they said, but that's their opinion. I didn't like that. Not a deal breaker, but we haven't spoken to Canada today. He's called, and we'll see." The CCP's internal struggles have intensified recently, and political rumors are rife. The CCP announced on Wednesday that the Politburo of the CCP held a meeting and decided to convene the fourth plenary session of the 20th CCP Central Committee in Beijing in October. The main agenda of the fourth plenary session is for the Politburo to report on its work to the Central Committee and to study China's 15th five-year plan. The fourth plenary session of the Central Committee was supposed to be held last October, but it was delayed for a whole year. The reason for the delay is speculated to be related to the intensification of the internal struggles. According to a Beijing political insider, there has been a lot of high-level controversy over the direction of the fourth plenum, with many incumbent and retired cadres dissatisfied with the current economic predicament and calling on Xi Jinping to return to pragmatic development and to engage more in the economy development and less in struggles. Recently, there have been a number of cases of senior officials falling from the ranks of the CCP, especially in the military, where there has been a large-scale purge. The date for the fourth plenary session has also been interpreted as a sign that factions within the CCP have reached an agreement. In October of 2022, Xi Jinping arranged for a large number of his cronies to take full control of key positions in the Communist Party, the military, and the government. However, a complex struggle for power soon emerged within. During this period, Ministers of National Defense Li Shangfu and Wei Fenghe stepped down one after another. In last November, Miao Hua, a member of the Central Military Commission and director of the Political Work Department of the Military Commission, stepped down. In March, the vice chairman of the Military Commission, He Weidong, disappeared. Recently, there have been rumors about CCP veterans taking power behind the scenes and possible changes in the fourth plenary session of the CPC Central Committee and even multiple versions of Xi Jinping's successor. In addition to repeating the basic wording of the CCP's approach to economic governance in recent years, the official media release also mentions that the CCP Politburo also discussed other issues at its meeting. Moreover, Deng Xiaoping's theory, Jiang Zemin's theory, Hu Jintao's theory, and Xi Jinping's theory were all listed in the press release of the conference as the guiding principles of the 10th five-year plan period. Traditional ideologies such as Marxism, Leninism, and Mao Zedong thought were also mentioned. Such a complete set of listings has aroused great concern from the public. Some scholars have pointed out that against the backdrop of the high level of focus on Xi Jinping's ideology in recent years, this is an unusual move and suggests that the CCP may be adjusting the focus of its internal propaganda with the intention of downplaying Xi Jinping's status as a person above all, and no longer adhering to his personal ideology. Informed sources in the political arena revealed that the relisting of the concepts of Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, and Hu Jintao periods in this circular is the result of a compromise by Xi Jinping. And it is possible that the fourth plenum communique will incorporate some of the ideas of reform and liberalization. Zhong Cheng-shi, a researcher on the history of the CCP, said that the meeting's renaming of the former leader's ideology is a signal that Xi Jinping's ideology is being challenged within the party, and that the top echelons of the hierarchy may already have reservations about his line of governments. He points out that the patriarchs and technocrats want to return to the mode of governance of the Hu Wen era, and that Xi Jinping has to compromise for the time being, even though he may not be willing to do so. Almost simultaneously, another sensational event took place in China, further confirming that the rumors of infighting in the CCP were not just empty talk. In other news related to the infighting in the Chinese Communist Party, the abbot of China's famed Shaolin Temple, Shi Yongxin, is under investigation. Shi is accused of suspected embezzlement and improper relationships with women. People may wonder how a monk can be related to the infighting in the Chinese Communist Party. This is because he's not an ordinary monk. He is a political monk or a business monk. The public knows a lot about his business activities. Shi Yongxin has been in charge of the temple affairs of Shaolin Temple for 38 years since August of 1987. He's known as CEO monk for his entrepreneurial endeavors that transformed the Buddhist monastery into a commercial empire. The monks of the Shaolin Temple are known for their superior martial arts. But before, Chinese monks were not allowed to practice martial arts. However, the monks of the Shaolin Temple have that privilege because 1400 years ago, 13 Shaolin monks used the sticks in their hands to save Emperor Tong Taizong, who was one of the greatest emperors in Chinese history, from being chased by his rivals. From then on, the emperor granted the Shaolin monks the privilege of practicing martial arts. In 2002, the Discovery Channel in the United States filmed a TV movie for Shi Yongxin called The New Shaolin Abbot. At this time, Shi Yongxin had taken over as the abbot of Shaolin Temple for only 3 years, and at this time, the Western media's interest in the Shaolin Temple was not commercialization, but rather it was on behalf of Chinese Kung Fu. When the documentary was translated into English, abbot was translated as CEO, simply because it was difficult to find an English equivalent for the Chinese Buddhist term abbot. It was an unintentional move, but it was prophetic. Shi Yongxin is indeed doing a great job of commercializing the Shaolin Temple business. The business of his registered Henan Shaolin Temple Industrial Development Company ranges from branding licensing and cultural tourism development. The company is highly regarded for its wide business atmosphere and lucrative properties. And in addition to the flagship store, the Henan Shaolin Temple Industrial Development Company, Shi Yongxin is also a shareholder of 18 Shaolin Temple shareholding enterprises. But because religious institutions are not legal persons, they cannot take shares. So, Shaolin Temple shares in these companies are in the name of Shi Yongxin personally. He claims externally that these shares in his personal name were not personal property. He himself is not involved in the management of the company, and he does not take dividends. But all this is not the reality. In 2015, Shi Yongxin's most relied on disciple, Shi Yan Lu, struck back with a loud report on Shih, exposing his de facto control of the company and his misappropriation of the monastery's income. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Not only did he embezzle from the company, but he had more than one mistress and illegitimate children as well. The incident was such a sensation that officials could not avoid it, and they sent an investigation team to look into it. However, the official final conclusion given after the investigation was actually that it was all just a misunderstanding, and that Shih did not have any inappropriate male-female relationships or major problems, but only a small financial loophole. So in the end, it went nowhere. Now, 10 years later, the CCP is investigating him for the same offenses. This time it turns out to be solid evidence. The reason is simple. Shih has been able to run amok for the past 20 years because he had the backing of senior government officials. In 2015, when Shih was interviewed by the BBC, when the interviewer raised the issue of disclosing income and accounts, the abbot was momentarily speechless and stammered with, "We are not independent. We have to consider many, many factors." Anyone who knows the discourse system of the CCP understands the meaning behind his words is that there are complicated interests behind those companies. The earnings of the companies are also to be shared with these top officials. Perhaps there are also factors other than financial interests. Sources with knowledge of the CCP's inner workings analyze that the supportive force behind Shih early on was the top echelons of the Jiang Zemin faction, and he was later taken under Xi Jinping's wing. And he became a key player in the CCP's overseas United Front infiltration and the One Belt, One Road strategy. The fact that Shih is now back under investigation suggests that the forces behind him are no longer able to protect him. And Wen Jiabo's political ally, former Vice Premier Wu Yi, rebuked Shih 20 years ago. So the purging of Shih is also seen as the rise of Wen Jiabo's influence. And this is also consistent with our analysis in our prior shows. So the Fed didn't lower interest rates again, and President Trump is very annoyed. Perhaps he would like to go back to a time when the Fed was first established. In the early days, the Fed, although legally independent, cooperated with the Treasury Department on many policies. By the 1930s, the Fed had become almost part of the government, cooperating with the government's needs exactly as required by the Department of Treasury before the abrogation of the Gold Clause in 1933. When the Fed was formed, the United States was on the gold standard. That is, for every dollar the government issued, it had to be backed by 40% gold. So how much money the Fed could print depended on how much gold was on hand. The gold standard made sense in theory. The money had intrinsic value and was not debt like fiat currency. Back then, the Fed certainly couldn't just print money at will. It had to have the gold to back it. But the Fed felt hemmed in during its operations. In 1929, the global economy encountered a 4-year-long Great Recession, entering the worst depression before World War II. And in the Depression, people distrusted paper money and they wanted the actual gold. And the Fed had less and less gold on hand, down from 4.5 billion to 3.2 billion, and a reduction of almost 30%. Then the Fed could print less and less money. According to modern economic theory, the more depressed the economy is, the more the government should stimulate the economy and the Fed should print more money. But the Fed's ability to print money shrunk instead. So President Roosevelt decided to take action in 1934. He enacted the Gold Reserve Act and abandoned the gold standard, and he nationalized gold so that the Fed would give it to the Department of Treasury. This was tantamount to hollowing out the Fed's power to issue money, which could only be directed by the Department of Treasury. Abandoning the gold standard did, in the circumstances, solve the government's immediate challenges, and it also brought about more long-term problems. We'll talk about this more in detail later. It's also a sad state of affairs for mankind that it often creates more problems while trying to solve one. Soon after, in 1939, World War II broke out. In response to the war, the Fed almost disappeared, even from its apparent independence. When the Treasury issued Treasury bonds, the Fed would buy them at a very low interest rate in order to help finance the government. But during this period, the Fed still complained to have had almost no independence at all. World War II ended in 1945, but soon the Korean War began again. The Fed still needed help financing the government. President Truman wanted to continue the Roosevelt-era approach of having the Treasury issue Treasury bonds and the Fed to increase its reserve balances to buy them. But this time, the Fed said no to the government because the Fed had printed too much money before, driving inflation to a high of 9%. In the long run, the economy would be in serious trouble. After a long and heated negotiation, the Treasury backed down. The two sides signed the Monetary Accord of 1951, and the Fed no longer buys Treasury bonds at a fixed rate. The Fed is firmly established as the primary authority for monetary policy, and it gained the autonomy to adjust interest rates. It is widely recognized that the true independence of the contemporary Fed began with the Monetary Accord of 1951. However, the Treasury retained its core responsibilities in managing government finances. This includes overseeing the national debt and government accounts. Despite their distinct roles, the Fed and the Treasury cooperate to ensure their policies align and to avoid conflicts that could destabilize the economy. But independence came at a price. After the victory, Mariner Eccles, the Fed chair at the time, resigned, and he was replaced by William Martin, the Assistant Secretary for Negotiations on behalf of the Department of Treasury. The Treasury Department had expected William Martin to recognize the friendship of his colleagues and to be more responsive to the needs of the government in monetary policy, but instead, Martin became the founder of the Fed's independence, serving nearly 20 years as its longest-serving chairman, and the Fed even has a building named after him. So what exactly did Martin do, and how did he affect the Fed's policy logic and the game-playing relationship between the Fed and the Treasury? We'll resume this story tomorrow. That's a wrap for this episode. Thank you so much for your support of Front Page. Please remember to leave a comment below the video. This is really helping us to be seen all around the world. The more people who watch Front Page, the more freedom-loving people the world will have. And please hit the like button and hit the notification bell after subscribing. And please share this video with your friends and family because everybody deserves to know the truth.